I'm going to be telling you a story about Toby. Enjoy, and just let you know I will not say things really right, but I'll try my best to tell the story. And I hope you guys enjoyed the video or live stream. The long road home seemed to go on and on. The road continued, outstretched in front of the vehicles and endlessly. The light that shone through the branches of the tall green trees danced across the window in random patterns. Every once in a while, obviously shining in your eyes, the surrounding was full of deep green trees forming a forest around the road. The only sound was the sound of the car's engine as it traveled down the path. It was peaceful and let off a serene feeling, although the ride seemed like a nice one. It lacked every form of nice for both passengers. The middle-aged woman behind the steering wheel had a neat short brown hair that fit her complexion white, quite well. She wore a green V-neck T-shirt, a pair of blue jeans. Diamond-stud earrings decorated each of her ears, which partly showed from behind her haircut. She had deep green eyes, which brought out her shirt. The light seemed to make them more noticeable. There was much significance to her appearance. She just looked like average mother that you see on TV shows and such, but one thing for sure made her different from those average mothers, and that was the dark bags under her eyes. Her facial expression was gloomy and sad, although she genuinely looked like one who smiled a lot. She would sniffle every once in a while, and occasionally glance back in the rear view mirror to look back at her son in the back seat, who was hunched over, partly his arm held tight around his chest and his head pressed against the cold window. The boy lacked any normal appearance. Anyone blandly see that something was wrong with him. His messy brown hair went in every which way. His pale, almost gray skin was brought out by luminescent lightning. His eyes were dark, unlike his mother's. He wore a white T-shirt and scrub pants that had been provided to him by the hospital. The clothes he had worn before were so shred and blood-stained they weren't wearable anymore. The right side of his face bared a few cuts along of his split eyebrow. His right arm was bandaged up all the way up to his shoulder, which had been shredded when his right side had hit the shattered glass. His injuries appeared to be painful when he couldn't feel a thing. He never could feel a thing. That was just one of the glories about being him. One of the many challenges he had to face growing up with a rare disease that caused him to be completely numb towards pain. Never before had he felt himself get hurt. He could have lost an arm and felt nothing. That and any major disorders he had faced was that deemed him many insulting nicknames. In short time he attended grade school. Before he moved on to schooling was his tutoring syndrome, which caused him to tick and twitch in a way he couldn't control. He would crack his neck uncontrollably and twitch every once in a while. The kids would tease him and call him Ticky Toby and mock him with exaggeration, twitching and laughing. It got so bad he turned to homeschooling. It was too hard for him in common learning environment with seemingly every kid poking or more like stabbing fun at him. Toby stared blankly out the window. His face was empty of the speck of available emotion, and every few minutes his shoulder, arm, or foot would twitch. Every bump that the car tires hit made him stomach turn. So, Toby Rogers was the boy's name, and the last time Toby remembered riding car was when it crashed. That's all he thought about, unconsciously replaying everything he had remembered before he blacked out over and over again. Toby had been lucky when his sister hasn't been so lucky. When the thought of his older sister came, he couldn't help but let his eyes begin to tear up. The horrible memories replayed in his mind, her screaming that had been cut off with the in front of the car was smashed and all went blank for a moment before Toby opened his eyes to see his sister's body, her hair, her forehead pierced with glass shards. Her hips and legs were crushed under the force of the steering wheel, her torso pushed in front of the late inflated airbag. This was the last thing he had seen of his dear old sister. The road home continued on and would forever. It took so long to get home due to his mother wanting to avoid passing the site of the crash when the surroundings gave into a familiar neighborhood. They had both been more than ready to get out of the car and step back into their home. It was an older neighborhood with quaint little house, all next to each other. The car drove in front of a little blue house with white window panes. They both quickly noticed the old vehicle was parked in front of the house and a familiar figure who stood out in the driveway. Toby felt automatic anger and frustration to take over him at the sight of his father who wasn't there. His mother pulled the car up into the driveway beside him before turning off the engine and preparing to step out and face her husband. "Why is he here?" Toby said quietly as he looked back at his mother, who reached to open the car door. "He's your father, Toby. he's here because he wants to see you," his mother responded with a monotone voice, trying to sound less shaky. "Yet he have driven up to the hospital to see Lyra before she died." Toby narrowed his eye out the window. "He was drunk that night, honey. He couldn't drive." "Yeah, is he not?" Toby pushed the door open before his mother stumbled out onto the driveway, where he met his father's gaze before looking down at his feet with a stern expression. His mother stepped out behind him and met eyes before walking around the car. His father opened his arms, expecting a hug from his wife, but she walked past him and put her arm around Toby's shoulder and influenced him to begin walking inside. "Connie?" her husband began to say under a raspy voice. "What? No, welcome home? Hug, huh?" She ignored her husband's omniscient words and walked past him with her son under her arm. "Hey, he's 16. He can walk by himself." His father began to follow them in. "He's 17. Connie glares back at him before opening the door and stepping inside. "Toby, why don't we get you in your room to rest? I'll come get you when dinner is ready." "No, I'm 16. I can walk by myself," Toby said sarcastically and glared back at his father before stumbling up the small staircase and turning into his room, where he slammed the door violently. His little room didn't have much in it, just a small bed, a dresser, a window, and his walls had a few framed pictures of his family back when they were a family, before his father became an alcoholic and acted violently towards the rest of his family. Toby remembered when he was arguing with his mother and he grabbed her by the hair and shoved her to the floor. And when Lyra tried to break it up, he pushed her and she hit her back on the corner of the kitchen counter. Toby could never forgive him for what he did to his mother and sister. Never. Toby didn't care how much his father beat him down. He couldn't feel it anyways. What he did care about was how he intentionally hurt the only two people he cared about. And when he waiting in the hospital where his sister took her last few breaths, the only person who didn't rush there was his dad. Toby stood by the window and looked out onto the street. He could have sworn he saw things out there of the corner of his eye, but quickly blamed it on medication he had been put on when dinner time had come around and his mother called up to him. Toby came down the stairs and hesitantly sat down at the table across from his father and between his mother and empty chair. It was quiet, and as his parents picked at their food, but Toby refused to eat. Instead, he just watched his dad blink with a blank stare. His mother caught onto his stare towards his father and elbowed him slightly. Toby looked over at her slightly and looked down at his uneaten food, in which he didn't touch. Toby laid in bed. He pulled his covers over his head and stared at the window. He was tired, but there was no way he could fall asleep. He couldn't. There was too much to think about. He had been debating on whether or not to follow his mother's directions and forgive his father or continue holding a grudge with his boiling hatred. He heard his door creak open. His mother paddled in the room and sat on the bed next to him. She reached over and rubbed his back, which had been turned to her. I know it's hard, Toby. Trust me, I understand, but I promise you it will get better, she said softly. When is he going to leave? Toby said with innocent tone in his shaky voice. Connie let her gaze fall down to her feet. I don't know, honey. He's staying as far as I know. Toby didn't respond. He just continued to look forward at the wall, holding his damaged arm near to his chest. After a few minutes of silence, his mother sighed before she leaned in to kiss his cheek and stood up to walk out of his room. Good night, she said, as she closed the door. The hours passed slowly, and Toby couldn't quit tossing and turning every time he let his imagination take over. He heard the screeching of tires, the screaming of his sister. He could uncontrollably jerk in bed. He threw off his covers laying on his back. He pulled his pillow over his face and cried into it. He could feel his chest rise and fall as he let out a shaky breath as he cried. He could hear his own fitful weeping. He would have been screaming, crying if he didn't press his pillow over his face. After a few seconds, he threw the pillow off his face as well and sat up, hunched over, holding his head and bravely ruffling. Tears streamed from his eyes. He couldn't help but cry. He tried to keep it in, but he couldn't help but whine and whimper as he sat there shaking. He inhaled before he stood up and walked around his bed to the window, peered out, taking deep breaths, trying to calm down. He rubbed his eyes and looked out at the group of tall pine trees across the street. He stopped suddenly, and his gaze slowly centered on something standing under the tree. Lightly, he heard ringing in his ear. He couldn't look away. The figure stood beside the street light, about 2 feet shorter than it, long arms draped its sides as it stared up at him with non-existent eyes. The figure had no features whatsoever, no eyes, no mouth, no nose, yet it held Toby's hypnotic stares, seeming piercing into his very being. The ringing in his ear grew louder and louder. Second, he stared before suddenly it all went black. The next morning, Toby woke up in his bed. He felt different. He wasn't tired at all. And when he consciously woke up, it felt like he had been lying there awake for hours. He had no thoughts flowing through his mind. He sat up slowly and stumped over to the wall. But when he stood up, he automatically felt dizzy. He stumbled to the doorway and walked downstairs. His parents were sitting at the table. His father was in tune with the small TV that sat on the countertop. asked his mother, reading a newspaper. She quickly looked over when she felt Toby Princess looming behind her. Well, good morning, sleepyhead. You have been sleeping forever. She greeted him with a hesitated smile. Toby slowly looked over at the clock and noticed it was 12:30 p.m. I made you breakfast, but it got cold. I was going to wake you up, but I felt you need sleep. Her expression fell from happy to worried as her son resisted responding to her. Are you all right? Tommy stumbled over and sat by his father. He felt as if was on idle and had no control over his actions. He was seeing everything he did, but it didn't seem to register in his brain properly. He reached out to his father's arm, but his hand ended up getting slapped. His father turned to him uh, abruptly and pushed his chair over with his foot. Don't touch me, boy, he yelled. His mother stood up. All right, knock that off. That is the last thing we need. The days went by and things continued on as they were. Connie spent most of her time cleaning up the house, and her rude husband spent most of the time ordering her around. It was just how it used to be before the crash. Toby never really left his room. He would sit by his bed. It trembled. His mind would wander, but his thoughts changed too fast to be remembered. He would pace all around his small room like a caged animal or stare out the window. The unhealthy cycle continued to submissive to him, and Toby remained in his room before he could think twice. He would begin to chew on his hands, tearing the flesh from his fingers. He would gnaw his hand until they bled. When his mother walked in on him while he was doing so, she reacted horribly. She rushed him downstairs, grabbed the first aid kit, wrapping his hands in it. She demanded that he wouldn't leave her side from them. He isolated himself so much that he grew up to hate being around others. His memories grew glitchy as well. He he'd start missing memories of minutes, hours, days, and so on. He would begin talking nonsense about things completely unrelated conversations he would have. He'd he'd go on. He would be talking. He would be going on. He would go off about seeing things, sharks in a sink, as he washed the dishes, hearing crickets in his pillow and seeing ghosts outside his bedroom. But hearing ghosts outside his bedroom window, all the nonsense landed him in counselor's office. His mother grew too anxious about his mental health. She decided it would be good for him to talk to professionals about what he was feeling. Connie walked Toby into the building, holding his hand, guiding him. She walked up to the front desk and began talking to the lady who sat behind it. Mr. Rogers, the lady asked. Mr. Rogers? Yes, that's me. Connie nodded. We're here to see the doctor. Oliver, I'm here with Toby Rogers. Yes, right this way. The lady stood up and led them down a long hallway. So Toby looked at the framed artwork down the hall, tuned it to the sound of lady high heels on the hardwood floor. She opened the door to a room with a table and two chairs. If we can get him to sit in here for a few minutes, I'll get the doctor. She smiled and held the door open. Toby stumbled into the room and sat down at the table. He looked over at his mother and the lady before the door slowly shut behind them. He looked around the room before he held up his tightly bandaged hands and began to bite at the bandage to unwrap his hands. But he was interrupted as the door swung open. A young woman in black and white spotted dress and light blonde hair stepped in, holding a clip tray, board, and a pen. Toby, she asked with a smile. Toby looked up at her and nodded. Nice to meet you, Toby. My name is Dr. Oliver. She put her hand out for him to shake, hesitantly pulled away when she noticed his bandaged hands. Oh, she smiled nervously before clearing her throat and sitting in the chair across the table from him. So I'm going to ask you a few questions. Try to answer then as honestly as possibly, okay? She placed her clipboards down on the table. Toby nodded slowly and his restrained hands in his laps. How old are you, Toby? 17, he responded quietly. She wrote that down on the paper that was clipped to the board. What is your full name? Toby Aaron Rogers. What is your birthday? April 28th. Who is your immediate family? Toby paused for a minute before answering the question. My mom, my dad, and he stopped. My sister. I heard about your sister, dear. I'm really sorry. Her expression faded into a sad, pity-filled look. Toby nodded. Do you remember anything from the crash? Toby looked away from her. His mind went blank for a moment. He looked down at his lap and his surroundings. He heard a faint ringing sound. His widened and then he froze in place. Toby, the counselor asked again. Toby, are you listening? Toby felt a shiver go down his spine until he froze once again and slowly looked over the little window through the door, where he saw a dark, featureless figure peering in at him. He stared, eyes widened, the ringing growing louder and louder until suddenly the loud voice of the counselor broke his trance. Toby! She yelled. Toby jumped and fell sideways out of his chair and back up into the corner. Dr. Olivia stood up. Stood up, holding her clipboard to her chest. A surprised look in her eyes. Toby met her eyes again, his reach itching as he twitched. That night, Toby laid in his bed. His eyes gazed as he stared straight up at the ceiling. He could feel himself being to doze off when he heard the scattering of footsteps down his hallway. He looked up towards the doorway, his door wide open. There was no light. Everything was glistened with the blue glow of the moonlight through his window, leaving a cold lighting. He stood up and slowly made his way towards the door. Suddenly, which was previously wide open, slammed in his face. He gasped and fell back, and he was out of breath. He hit the ground as he began breathing heavily. His eyes wide open, he waited for a few seconds before getting back up on his feet. He reached out and grasped the cold door handle with his bandaged hand and creaked it open. He looked into the dark hallways and tiptoed out of the room. The window at the end of the hallway lit up the darkness with blue moonlight. As he paddled away, he could hear footsteps rustling around him and fainted, giggling by the pincer patter of small feet, which sounded like a child had run in front of him, giggling and running around. The hallway was a lot longer than he had remembered. It seemed endless, like the ride home from the hospital. He heard a door creak in front of him. Mom, he called out in a shaky voice. Suddenly a door slammed behind him, and he jumped, turned around. Behind him, he heard a long, eerie groan from him. This sounded to croak his ear. He turned around fast as he could and was suddenly face to face with none other than his dead sister. Her eyes were clouded white. Her skin was pale. The right side of her jaw only dangled on by tissues and muscles. Glass protruding from her forehead and black blood leaking down her face. Her blonde hair pulled up back in a ponytail, as it always was, wearing her gray t-shirt, athlete shorts, which were dirty and spotted with blood. Her legs were bent in a way they shouldn't. She stood emitting a long, croaking noise, only in a way Toby's face. Toby yelled back, "Ah!" He called back away from her, not able to break the eye contact he led with blank, dead eyes. He dragged himself backwards until he backed up into something. He stopped for a second. Everything was dead silent except for his heavy breathing and crying. He slowly looked up to meet the blank face of the tall figure that stood over him. Behind the tall, dark mask were rows of children, looking to range from 3 to 10 years old. Their eyes completely black and dark, black-blooded, leaked from their eye sockets. He screamed and stood up fast as he could, tripped black tendrils that wrapped around his ankle. He fell straight on his stomach and got wind knocked out of his chest. He tried to scream out, but he couldn't. He wheezed out before it all went back black. Toby woke up with a start. He screamed out and sat as fast as he could. Completely short of breath, he wheezed out and his chest with his bandaged hands. It was just a dream, just a dream. He lay back down on his bed and rolled over on his side. It felt like giant waves and had been lifted off his chest as he took in deep breaths. He stood up and padded over to his window. He saw nothing. Nobody was out there. No ghosts, no figures, nothing. He heard the rustling coughing of his father of the doorway was closed. He walked over, opened it, looking out into the hallway once again. He padded down the hallway and into the kitchen where he found his dad standing and a smoke having a smoke in their living room. Toby waited a second and watched him from round the corner before a burning feeling started deep in his chest. Deep, boiling anger took over him. He heard the little imaginary voices in his head. Do it, do it, do it. Then he chanted. He turned away and held his arms. He felt like he actually had control over him, unlike he did for the past few weeks since he got home from the hospital. He actually had complete thoughts for moments before they were clouded by the chanting of the little voices. Kill him. He wasn't there. He wasn't there. Kill him. Kill him. They continued on. Toby trembled. No, he wasn't going to do that. Was he? Was he going crazy? No, he won't kill anyone. He can't. He hated his father, but hated no way he was going to kill him. No way he was going to kill him. That was it. The last thought he had before he fell into idle fate once again. The influences of the voices in his head was too much. He began to silently walk up behind his father. He reached over the counter to the knife holder in the kitchen and pulled out a largest knife that had been resting in the case. He gripped it in his hands and felt sensation took over. He let out a little snicker. And then he began laughing so hard he had to grasp for breath. His father turned around before he felt a brutal force shove him to the floor. He grunted as the hair was knocked out of him. What? He looked up at the boy who stood over him, grasping the kitchen knife in his hand. Toby, what are you doing? He went to sit up and put his arm out in front of himself, the fence, but before he knew it, Toby was on top of him. He went to grab at his neck, but his father reached out and blocked his hand, grabbing onto the wrist. Stop it! Get off of me, you little fricker! He yelled, and with his other hand, he threw an off-center punch towards Toby's shoulder, but he didn't stop. The look in Toby's eyes was not sane. It looked as if a demon had taken control over him. He yelled back and went to stab the knife into his father's chest, but he blocked him and grabbed onto his wrist once again. He went, shoved him back, but Toby kicked out his feet in front of him, landed a hard blow straight to his face. His father recoiled and pulled his arm away to cuff his face, but Toby got back up and drove the knife straight into his shoulder. His father let out a loud cry and went to pull the knife up, but before he could, Toby threw his fist straight into his face. He began to pound his fist into his head, laughing, wheezing. He cracked his neck and grabbed the knife and ripped it out of his shoulder. He drove it deep into his dad's chest, repeatedly stabbing his torso, the blood spilling out and getting splattered everywhere. He didn't stop until his father's body went still. He threw the knife over to the side and leaned over, his body coughing and panting. He stared at the smash in the face sat there twitching until a loud scream broke A silence. He looked over to see his mother standing a few feet away, covering her mouth, tears streaming down her eyes. Toby, she screamed. Why did he do that? She cried. Why? She screamed. Toby stood up and began to back away with his father's bloody corpse. He began to back out of the kitchen. He looked down at the blood-soaked bandages on his hands and looked up at his mother one last time before he turned and ran out of the house. He ran into the garage and slammed hand his hand against the control panel on the wall, pushed the button to open the garage door before he ran out. His father, two hatchets that had been hanging on the tool rack above a table full of jars filled to brim with old rusty nails and screws. One hatchet was new and a bright orange handle and a shiny blade. The other was a old wooden handle and a old dual blade. He grabbed both and looked down at the table, and his eyes met a box of matches, and under the table was a red gasoline tank. He had held both of the hatchets in one hand and grabbed the matches and gasoline before running out of the garage, down the driveway, up the street. As he approached the street light that he could see out his own bedroom, he heard no police sirens in the distance. He turned around, and the red and blue flashing light came rushing down the street. Toby stood for a second, but he pulled open the cap onto the gasoline tank and ran down the street, spilling gasoline all over the street. After him, he turned to run into the trees. He poured the last bit of gasoline out before he reached in his pocket and pulled out a match. He struck it against the box, immediately dropped it. In an instant, flames burst out around him. The fires caught onto the trees and bushed around him. Before he knew it, he was surrounded by fire. He slid houses of police cars were visible through the flames as he backed away into the forest around him. He looked around, but his vision was blurred. His heart was pounding. He closed his eyes for a moment. This was it. This was the end. Toby felt a hand on his shoulder. He opened his eyes and looked over to see a large white hand with long, bony fingers that rested on his shoulder. He folded the arm that was attached to the hand up to a towering dark figure. It appeared to be wearing a dark black suit, and its face was completely blank. It toward over Toby's small frame, and it looked down on him. Tendrils reached out from its back before Toby knew his vision blurred, and he was surrounded by sounds of ringing in his ears. Everything went black. That was it. That was the end. That's how Toby Rogers died. A few weeks later, Connie sat in her sister's kitchen. Her sister Lori sat next to her drinking a cup of coffee. About 3 weeks ago, Connie lost her husband and her son. A few weeks before, she lost her daughter to a car crash. Since then, she moved in with her sister. The police were keeping her busy. They had just finished cleaning up the case, and the story had been released 2 weeks ago, and the focus of the world seemed to have shifted to completely new stories. Lori switched on the TV to a news broadcast on TV, and the news reporter began introducing the new headline. We have breaking news. Last night there has been a reported murders of 4 individuals. There are no suspects yet, but the victims were a group of middle school kids who had been out in the woods late last night. The kids have been bludgeoned and stabbed to death. The investigators had discovered a weapon at the scene, which appeared to be an old dual-bladed hatchet. As you can see here, the picture changed to show snapshots of the weapon exactly as it was left on the crime scene. Investigators had pulled the name of a possible subject, Toby Rogers, a 17-year-old boy who a few weeks ago had stabbed his father to death and tried to cover up his escape by setting a fire in the streets. The forest area around the neighborhood, although they had believed in the young lady boy, had died in the fire. Investigators suspect that Rogers may still be alive due to the fact that his body was never found. And I'm done with the story.
Oh my God, shut up.
And I'm done with the story. Oh wow, this took me longer than I suspected it would be. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I finished. And I think I'm going to end this video here. I hope you guys liked my stream. It took me quite a while, as you can see. I know I messed up at some parts. It's because my voice is all skingy and stuff like that, and I don't know how to pronounce stuff because for some reason I don't know good English, even though I know English. And also, if you heard dogs in the background, those were my dogs. My voice, my voice needs a rest though. I'll see you guys later. I might make another stream later on, but yeah, I might tell Jeff the killer story or James or both, whatever whoever wants it. Just leave it in the comments, and if you can, or just like I don't know, something like that. And yeah. Bye. Hope you guys have a nice day. And yesterday was Toby's birthday. I believe in the creepypasta, so I hope he had a nice birthday with Masky and Hoodie and the other pastas. But yeah, now it's time for me to go and draw some stuff. Bye.